Next on the hit parade, we have Franzi Roesner. Franzi's an associate professor at the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. She directs the Security and Privacy Research Lab there, recipient of an MIT Technology Review Award, and Innovators Under 35, has an NSF CAREER Award. She got a BS from UT Austin and a PhD from University of Washington in 2014. And clearly they liked what they saw, because not only did they give her a job, but they gave her tenure there. So we're delighted to have Rosie here. And I will just let you take the speaker mic and take it away.
Sounds great. Just checking, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great.
We're seeing the presenter view.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, I'm probably sharing the wrong screen. Let's try this. How's that?
Beautiful.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, David, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to the workshop. This is a super exciting topic, and it's, I'm as you said in the introduction, I'm really excited to see kind of the huge breadth of interesting things that fall under this umbrella. So really excited to be here. As David said, I co-direct the Security and Privacy Research Lab at the University of Washington, where we focus broadly on computer security related topics, ranging from thinking about technologies to thinking about people, thinking about existing technologies that are already widely deployed, and thinking about emerging technologies that are not yet widely deployed, where we can still impact how they will be designed. So a huge range of things. And one of the areas that I've been interested in recently that I want to talk about today is online mis and disinformation. I think this is a phenomenon that everyone is familiar with at this point. I'm sure you've come across it on your own social media feeds, but we've seen concerns about mis and disinformation related to all sorts of important topics, most recently COVID vaccines, the 2020 election, and basically anything that people care about, you can probably find misinformation. A brief word on terminology. I tend to use the terms misinformation and disinformation interchangeably. Usually the way that they're used is that misinformation refers to false information that's spread unintentionally or is unintentionally false, and disinformation is intentional false information. But as we are looking at how this information spreads through our social media ecosystems and our information ecosystems, it's not always clear what the origin was, or the goal of the creator. So I tend to use them interchangeably for the vantage point that I look at them in my research. And of course, as we all know, these are not theoretical things, but they are really important in informing or misinforming the American public and others. So increasing numbers of Americans, or fractions of Americans, use social media in particular as a primary news source, and there is, of course, misinformation on all sorts of platforms, but it's gotten a lot of attention, particularly on social media. But despite that attention, we don't necessarily have a good understanding of some core questions about how it spreads and why it works. So there are a lot of different research questions that we can ask about misinformation on social media. The highest level question is, of course, how is it spreading? Why is it spreading? And then, of course, what can we do to stop it? Most of our attempts at understanding how it's working in the ecosystem today are aimed at ultimately trying to prevent its spread, whether that's through changing the design of the social media platforms, intervening with users, or anywhere in between. And there are a lot of sub-questions we can ask here, and I'll give kind of a flavor of those sub-questions. And what I'll build to is that different research methodologies need to be used to answer these different sub-questions. So we might have questions like, how much misinformation is there even on these platforms? Who's creating it, and how are they spreading it, and why? Different adversaries may have different goals, and we need to understand those different goals to understand how to defend against those different types of adversaries. Thinking about the people who ultimately see this information on their social media feeds, how are they interacting with it? Are they suspicious of it? How do they investigate it? Why do they investigate it? Do they reshare it? And all of these questions about what happens when this reaches the end users. And maybe most fundamentally, why does it work? There's something about the human brain as the attack surface in this space that's really interesting to me, that humans are ultimately vulnerable to this. And of course, this is not a new problem that's come about with social media. We've had misinformation and propaganda for probably as long as we've had societies. But of course, the scale and the role of technology in its spread today is what makes this computer science research problem now. And then we may want to know, how can we detect it, either automatically or with support from manual analysis or machine learning or otherwise. And how can we stop it? Maybe by changing how the social media platforms are designed. What kinds of interventions at the time that people try to share or that people view this information might help, and how can we measure whether and how they're helping? So this is clearly a huge set of questions, and it's a really important pressing problem that's facing our society now. So there's a lot of great work that people in all sorts of fields, ranging from computer science to information science, sociology, psychology, media studies, all sorts of areas that are looking at this. And one of the goals of this talk is to talk a little bit about how different research approaches can help us answer different questions here. So there are kind of two layers to this talk. The first layer is some of the work we've done and some concrete things we've found about how people interact with misinformation. But there's a second layer of the talk where I want to talk a little bit about methods, kind of in the related to the scope of this workshop in particular. So as we're thinking about these research questions, we can study the social media platforms themselves, look at content on them, their designs, and so on. We can study people separately or in conjunction with these platforms. How do people think about misinformation? What are they doing? Or we can think about kind of models and simulation. And there's probably other approaches that I haven't listed here. But relevant to my work, we can also think about this quantitatively. So we can do structured large-scale studies. Or we can think about it qualitatively, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like later on. But these are usually more in-depth, usually smaller scale studies, or we might look at, say, 20 people and how they interact with social media, as opposed to looking at data from millions of Facebook users. So like I said, what I want to do today is talk about two different studies that we've done in this space that are very different in their methodology. One is very quantitative and one is very qualitative. And so I'll describe those studies and what we learned from them about what people are doing on social media related to misinformation. But I also want to really highlight the things that we couldn't learn from these methodologies that are still open questions and that are not necessarily learnable through the methodologies that we've used here. So I'll start with the quantitative study. So this is a study of a large set of Facebook data. So this is a set of data made available through a partnership between Facebook and an organization called Social Science One. And this is a set of URLs that were shared on Facebook. Roughly the bulk of them were shared or reshared between 2017 and 2019. And they were URLs that were reshared or posted at least 100 times with some noise added in there that I'll mention in a minute. And this data set was made available through an application process through Social Science One. And so this is not an open data set, and that's one of the limitations that I'll speak to. But it's a really unique data set. A lot of past work looking at misinformation on Facebook has looked at kind of limited public information, like you might see interactions with public Facebook groups or from particular users or smaller scale studies. Or it's looked at platforms like Twitter, which are much more open than Facebook. So for all of its limitations, this data set was a really unique opportunity to see, get insights into the actual interaction of people with URLs that were shared on Facebook. There's a lot of data in here, about 42 million URLs, and those are associated with a bunch of user interaction data. So clicks, reshares, likes, angry faces, the whole set of Facebook interactions. And those interactions are coupled with demographic data from the users who did those interactions, particularly age brackets, gender, and then something that the data set calls political page affinity, which are basically buckets generated by Facebook into five different buckets from -2 to +2, where -2 is politically left-leaning, defined in terms of US politics, and +2 is politically right-leaning. So this data set, of course, there are a lot of privacy concerns that Facebook and researchers on Facebook have to contend with data coming from Facebook users. So part of this data set release involved differential privacy noise applied to the data set. That's why this only includes URLs that were shared at least 100 times. And this noise is there to essentially give the property that any individual user's interaction is protected here in a differential privacy sense, which means that there's plausible deniability whether any individual user or interaction is actually part of this data set. So there's plenty of limitations with this data set, including the fact that it's noisy, the fact that it is controlled by Facebook. We access it only on Facebook provided servers, so we can't actually audit this data set over time. Replication of this study is potentially challenging. There was an application process to get access to it in the first place. And as you'll see, there are a lot of questions it just doesn't answer because of the data that's in there. But nevertheless, it gives us this great opportunity to look at this perspective on this data and ask some research questions that are answerable by it. So the research questions that we focused on here were, first of all, how do Facebook users in our data set, and we focused on US Facebook users, how do they interact with known or potential mis or disinformation URLs? And I'll define what we mean by that in just a minute. And then we have this demographic information about these interactions. So what, if any, differences exist among different demographic groups of these US users and how they interact? One thing I want to say right off the bat, and I'll come back to it later, is that this is really an exploratory analysis of this set of Facebook data from 2017 to 2019 for these widely shared URLs. And even though I might slip up and sound like I'm making more generalizable claims, that's not what I intend. So this, fundamentally, this only tells us about how these users interacted with these Facebook URLs. It doesn't tell us anything generalizable about human behavior. It doesn't let us answer questions like, are people of a certain political persuasion more vulnerable to misinformation, period. That's just not a question we can or should try to answer with this data set. So in any case, we focused on US URLs or US user interaction. So these were basically URLs that were most shared in the US or had user interactions that were geolocated in the US. And so one question is, what are we comparing to? There are a lot of different things we could have compared to, but we took as our baseline essentially all US URLs in this data set. So this kind of gives us a sense of people's behavior on Facebook in general with respect to relatively widely shared URLs, so URLs that were reshared at least 100 times. And again here, this choice of baseline will influence our findings. We could have looked at news URLs, more specifically than all URLs. There's a lot of different types of URLs in here that people might interact with differently, but we wanted to choose a baseline that was kind of the most neutral in terms of us imposing our categorization of URLs here. So that's what we'll be comparing to. And then we want to look at mis and disinformation in this data set. That in and of itself is actually a really hard problem that our work does not answer, and lots of other people are thinking about this as well. How do we say that a given URL is mis or disinformation URL? That's super hard. We looked at basically two subsets that we thought gave us kind of a lower bound and a not exactly upper bound, but a much broader set. So that first set is URLs that were explicitly fact-checked as false by Facebook's fact-checking partners. So these are the ones that Facebook on the platform will label as false. Those were also labeled in the data set we had access to. The downside is there are not very many of them, and of course there's selection bias in those. They're the ones that Facebook has chosen to check. They tend to be very popular and therefore warrant checking. You can say demonstrably whether they're true or false, and of course a lot of misinformation may be more in the middle ground gray area. So we also look at a more general misinformation set that was based on a set of domains that we collected in our prior work that was itself put together by others' categorizations. And so here we're looking at essentially low quality news URLs, domains that were flagged by Snopes or otherwise. So this is probably too broad. Not every single URL on these domains is necessarily misinformation, but we used it as kind of an upper bound here. So let me answer a few kind of concrete questions that we can look at with this data, comparing our three subsets of URLs. So our all US baseline, our third-party fact-checked, and our broader misinformation set. So here's one example of something we can look at with this data, which is how quickly did these URLs spread. So throughout all the graphs I'll show, the green is the third-party fact-checked, the orange is the US baseline, and then the blue is the low-quality news. And so there's a couple of takeaways from this. This is showing sort of over time from the time of first posting, how often these URLs were shared over months. And so the first thing we see is, maybe not surprising, but that most URLs get this bump in the first month. We didn't have finer time granularity to look at spread within that first month. There's probably a lot of interesting dynamics there. But to me, one of the takeaways here is that interventions need to happen quickly. So, if Facebook is going to take 3 months to fact check something, then it's going to be too late. A bulk of the shares have already happened. The other thing that stands out here is, of course, this green line. The third-party fact-check URLs get shared more often, and there's kind of this tail where they continue to be shared more over time. But again, I would caution reading too much into this because of the selection bias of that set. These are, by definition, URLs that Facebook was interested in fact-checking. So they were, they probably were fact-checked because they were spreading a lot, not the other way around. Okay, so then we can look at differences in these different demographic groups, which was one of the core questions we were interested in. So the first thing we can look at is who saw URLs in these different categories. And one thing I want to be really clear about is when we say who saw these URLs, we're not necessarily saying anything about people. We're very much saying something about Facebook, or the combination of Facebook and its users. Because what Facebook is showing to people on their news feed is not entirely under control of the people seeing it. So this doesn't necessarily say who has chosen to see these URLs in their news feed. They might have, to some extent, chosen to follow certain pages. But even that may be due to what Facebook's algorithm has surfaced to them in the past. So this is a really tricky underlying challenge with this kind of platform data, is that the choices of the platform itself influence what we see. So again, this is why I want to be really careful not to say that this is necessarily telling us anything inherent about people so much as the combination of Facebook and the people. In any case, what we see here is that, again, looking at the green and blue bars as being the potential mis and disinformation, what we see is, comparing to the baseline, there are certain demographic groups that see these low quality URLs more often. They're shown them more often on Facebook. So that includes male users, users who are in the older age brackets. So you can see that the green and blue bars are larger compared to the orange bar for these segments of the demographics that I'm highlighting. And users with kind of right-leaning, more conservative political page affinity. One of the things we were interested in was looking at, there's a lot of overlap in these different demographics. So an individual, of course, fits into multiple of these buckets. So one question is, how do these different demographic factors interplay? And so we can look at this also. I'll show you this heat map, and I'll use it for a few other results. We can look at essentially this cross section of age bracket and political page affinity. So one square in this heat map is a given age bracket crossed with a given political page affinity. And then the percentage range in there, the range is reflecting the differential privacy noise that's in there. So this is showing you basically 95% confidence intervals. And this is showing you what fraction or what percentage of URLs viewed were viewed by that demographic group. So this is for our baseline set. And again, we can look at our misinformation subsets, and we can see that, again, reflecting the same conclusion as the earlier slide, that older and more conservative adults saw these misinformation URLs disproportionately more on Facebook. Once people see these URLs, so now Facebook has shown it to them, then what do people do? Well, they click on it or reshare it or click one of the other reactions. A couple of noteworthy findings here. One is that the data set gave us both shares, so people who clicked on the link and then reshared it, but also shares without clicks, so people who reshared the post containing the URL without clicking on the URL. And you may find this surprising or you may not find it surprising, but for all of the URL subsets, shares without clicks make up nearly half of those shares. So people often reshare without clicking. And also, again, may or may not surprise you, but the misinformation URLs saw more user engagement, kind of both in clicks and shares in particular than the baseline URLs. So again, we can look at who is doing the sharing and who is doing the clicking. We're going to look at a heat map. These heat maps are a little bit different. So this is the click-through heat map. So this is showing you again for the different age and political page affinity intersections, the click-through rate. So what fraction of URLs, baseline URLs that people in these buckets saw, did they click on? And so we can see that basically older users tend to click more frequently. And then what we looked at was the difference from baseline for the misinformation subsets. So this is going to show you the difference. So a 1 here means there was no difference from baseline in click-through rate. And so we saw something really interesting here that surprised us at least, which was that these difference heat maps don't have any particularly interesting hotspots. So there are no major differences, despite the differences in what people see, there are no major differences in what people click through in terms of demographic groups. And so again, this is not necessarily telling us anything about people. It might be telling us something about Facebook's algorithm and that it's good at predicting, or at least equally good across demographic group at predicting who's going to click on what. Then maybe the second piece of this is that we then do again see demographic differences when we look at sharing. So here's essentially the share through rate. If you saw a URL, did you share it at what rate in different demographic groups? And now we see these demographic differences emerge again. So even though click-through rates were relatively equal, older and more conservative US adults were more frequently resharing these low quality or known false URLs compared to their baseline click-through rates than other demographic groups. Okay, so I've thrown a bunch of data at you. I've basically shown you that what we concluded from our analysis of this data set was that there is, perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of engagement with these known or potential mis and disinformation URLs, and that there's evidence that older and more politically conservative adults engage with it more, but with some caveats like the lack of differences in click-through rates. And so, these findings have some implications for future study questions, like we can ask why for all of these different things. Why do we see these differences? What are different demographic groups doing differently? And they also give us implications for defenses. Like it seems that interventions at the time of viewing or interventions even before people view it are critical. At sharing time is too late. So this type of study can be really valuable for helping lead us down those paths. But there are also a lot of things that this study doesn't tell us. So this is kind of the meta theme of my talk. There are a lot of questions you might be having in your mind about our conclusions here. I've already given you a lot of caveats, but we can ask about, what were these definitions of our baseline and our mis and disinformation subsets the right ones to look at? And there are many different ones we could have looked at. Which are the right ones? And how do we compare them? I also talked a bit about this, the unclear role of Facebook's newsfeed algorithm and all the other platform design features, not just at the time of this data, but also in shaping people's behavior over many years of using the platform. And there's been a lot of interesting work. I've cited here both a paper and a talk that talk more about this, this kind of fundamental kind of challenge of how do we even think about interpreting platform data in the context of the fact that the platform design itself is not neutral. And then finally, this type of quantitative study gives us a lot of what, but it doesn't give us a lot of why. It doesn't tell us why we see these differences or why people are sharing without clicking, what they're actually doing. Maybe they're Googling in the background. All sorts of questions that are raised by this data, and raising the questions, of course, is a valuable contribution, but this type of methodology and this type of data set doesn't answer that for us. So I know we're getting close to the end of time, and my second part here is much shorter, but I want to talk a little bit about a qualitative study that we did. So for those of you who aren't familiar with qualitative research methods, which I was not myself at some point, these are things that look like in-depth interviews with individual participants or focus groups or observing people as they use technology or whatever it is that you're studying. And I think one easy misconception, if you've not been exposed to this type of research method before, is that these are not sort of bad quantitative methods. And I don't mean to criticize anyone who might think this. This is what I thought initially. I used to think, like, how can you draw any conclusions from a study that has 20 participants? That doesn't seem very scientific. And what I learned is that this is a fundamentally different scientific methodology with fundamentally different research goals. Qualitative methods allow you to do kind of an in-depth study of people and explore things in much more richness than the quantitative methods that I just talked about. And usually the goal is to surface themes, like what are the different ways that people do things? What are the types of reactions or challenges that people have? And not necessarily counting how prevalent those types of reactions are in a population. And there's also an important potential difference of the role of the researcher as a research instrument and the perspective that the researcher brings to the analysis. Although I would argue we should ask the same questions of our role in quantitative methods as well. So this is not better or worse, but it answers very different questions. So to give you an example, we did a qualitative study around very related research questions, but focused more on people interacting with Facebook and Twitter. So how do they interact with misinformation on those platforms? Why and how do they choose to investigate things that seem suspicious to them? And then again, partially looking at this high level goal of what is the role of the platform in making this problem better. It's kind of a standard qualitative research methodology. We had 25 participants. This was pre-COVID, so we met with them in person, either on campus or in a coffee shop in Seattle, and we interviewed them about their social media usage. We then observed them scrolling through their actual social media feeds. We modified those feeds to make sure that they included some known misinformation. And then we interviewed them about their experiences specifically with misinformation at the end. We didn't mention that at the beginning to avoid priming them to the potential presence of misinformation. And then at the end, we debriefed them about the actual nature of the study, that we had changed their feed temporarily and which things we had shown them that were misinformation. So briefly, we did this with a browser extension that took known misinformation content that we injected into their feeds. So we took posts that were in their feeds with the original poster, like maybe it was their friend, and instead of their friend's actual post, it appeared as though the friend had posted this thing known to us to be misinformation. And there's lots of ethics questions here. I won't get into it in depth now, but one key part of the design was that participants couldn't accidentally share this misinformation, and we debriefed them at the end. So what we find from this kind of study is very different than what we find from the quantitative study. So this is a summary of our findings. Basically, what do people do when they see a post? And we can categorize from our interviews these different types of things that people do. So they might choose to ignore the post because they've identified that it looks like an ad. They might take it at face value because they say, oh, my friend, so-and-so posted that, and I know they know a lot about this topic, and so I trust that they've vetted this. Or they might be skeptical. And so we were particularly interested in the people who were skeptical and the reasons for that and what they then did. So reasons for being skeptical, include it just looks weird. It kind of have a weird gut feeling. It seems unbelievable. Sometimes, surprisingly often, people would then choose still not to investigate because they just were tired of hearing about political news, or they described, this wasn't during our study, but they described it's hard to do on a mobile device, or they're just not interested in this topic. Like it looked suspicious, but they don't want to read more about Afghanistan or whatever it is. When people do investigate, they use strategies that probably sound familiar, like they might investigate the claims directly by doing a Google search. They might evaluate how much they trust the source, like CNN compared to, I think there were, I can't remember now, but in the study, there was sort of a fake CNN example. This is say they investigate kind of their gut feeling of those. They look at the comment threads, they compare with other sources that they find, and so on. One thing I would caution here is that I think especially those of us who are attuned to the presence of information, misinformation, I think we think that we do these strategies more often than we do. So you might observe yourself as you're scrolling through your social media feeds, doing some of the other things in this taxonomy. And in fact, some of our participants even describe using some of these strategies, but then were fooled by the misinformation that we had inserted into their feed. And there are totally legitimate reasons that those things happen. So a couple of participant quotes. One is on the topic of overconfidence. Sometimes people think, this doesn't apply to me, or this doesn't apply to my demographic group. So one person said, I tend to associate fake news with the political right, and I don't follow anything on the right. So I don't expect to see misinformation in my feed. Or people might not investigate because they just don't spend a lot of time on it. People scroll through their feeds really quickly. One participant estimated that they spend probably less than 8 seconds on a tweet. And that's not a lot of time to kind of deploy these different strategies. Okay, so let me kind of take a step back here in the last couple of minutes. This type of qualitative study is very different from the quantitative study I mentioned at the beginning, and it gives us very different types of findings. So in this case, we documented this variety of reasons that people do or don't investigate social media posts and how they do it. But this type of study doesn't really tell us anything about how often this is done, how effective it is. We have some sense, I skipped the results, I'm happy to talk about them more if anyone's interested. We have some sense of what interventions work. We've seen that platform interventions don't necessarily work, but people use other strategies like Googling or using comment threads. And those can give us a sense of where to investigate in the future. We can now take some of these questions and go back to quantitative methods and say, how prevalent are these methods? How effective are they? Apply them maybe to social media data again, and go back and forth between these two types of methodologies. And of course, there's limitations with the qualitative study. Despite being appropriate for the methods, the sample is small. It came from a Seattle population, which is potentially overeducated and overly liberal leaning compared to the population of the whole country. They were also doing this with us watching. It was their own actual social media feed, but it was not a totally ecologically valid setting. And while this can give us these really interesting themes, it doesn't tell us, again, how prevalent they are or how they generalize to a broader population. So the high level point I want to end on is just to emphasize that, of course, these different methods have different strengths and limitations. None of them gives us the full picture for the questions that we're asking, but they can work together also with other methods like simulation to help triangulate this full picture. And maybe the last thought is that even a part of the picture, of course, has scientific value, and we just have to be careful about not trying to overstate the questions that we can answer with our different methods, because some methods just, or some data sets just fundamentally can't answer questions that we'd like to answer. We might want to say things fundamentally about human behavior, but we can't necessarily do that. We have to say it in the context of what the data we have is showing us. So this work was done in collaboration with a bunch of great people at UW, and I will stop there, and I hope we have time for at least a question or two. But I know we're running short on time, so I'm also happy to chat offline about any of these studies or methods or anything else.
So there is one question in the chat, and I think that you can field that. It says, can you talk about the importance and/or capability of automatically determining what disinformation is more or less dangerous, and dangerous to what end?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think maybe stepping back, one thing I didn't say, but that I think maybe because it's so obvious to me is one question you might ask is misinformation a computer security question? And I'm a computer security person, so everything is a computer security question to me. But I think the idea of threat modeling that we use in computer security is really applicable here. And so different actors have different goals in spreading mis or disinformation. And I think we need to understand it in those. I can't speak to how well to the specific question. I can't speak to how well we can do this automatically, but I think it is definitely an important question to ask, because the defenses you'll take are different depending on, if the actors are motivated by financial gain, like they're trying to get you to click through on clickbait and load a bunch of ads. That's very different and has different harms than a nation state adversary trying to change public opinion to influence an election. Those have different types of harms. You can argue that one is more dangerous than the other. But I think intent and impact is definitely an important piece of the puzzle here, and not just is it true or not.
Great, thanks very much. There is another question, but maybe we can push that off to the question and answer towards the end and move on to the next talk.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. That's very interesting.
I have a question for Franzi, if she's here.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. So in your the data set that you had, you were able to get demographic information, right? I mean, and that was just provided to you by Facebook, or okay. So since this is a workshop on security and privacy, I was just curious what happens if people hide that information, or I mean, Facebook, can Facebook give it to you without people's permission, or I mean, is it only people who make that information available to anybody, or how does that work? And what if that information is not available? Is there any other way to get that information? Just curious.
No, it's an excellent question. I can't speak. I mean, it's stepping back all the way. Certainly, Facebook has always been in an interesting position with respect to privacy. I think there, in the context of this particular data set, there's, of course, a tension between privacy and transparency, in the sense that Facebook has also taken a lot of heat recently for lack of transparency related to mis and disinformation. And so I do think there's value in, figuring out how to allow external researchers to study some of these questions that are otherwise only visible to Facebook, though still filtered through, what Facebook is making available. So there's value to external study to these questions. But yes, of course, I'm also certainly value privacy highly as a privacy researcher and as a user of Facebook. I think part of the limitations on this data set come from Facebook reacting to prior concerns about this. I can't answer your specific question about whether there are any settings that users could have had applied to their accounts that would have prevented their data from being in here. I don't know the answer to that. But given that data was in there, the privacy protections that were applied were the differential privacy noise that was added. So theoretically, that should provide plausible deniability for any individual in there. That was also coupled with a research agreement that we had to sign in getting access to the data, that we would not try to de-anonymize any individuals. And we could only access the data, like I think I mentioned, on Facebook provided servers, which has replicability limitations, but I think, as a Facebook user, makes sense from a privacy perspective. Yeah, I think that's there's a line there, and certainly they were reacting to some of the Cambridge Analytica research on users' concerns, and it took actually a long time for this data set to become available. I think we were told we would get access something like, I want to say, almost a year before we actually got it. So I'm certain they were working through difficult things on their side, but. Yeah, as with any company, Facebook is also a company of many facets and many teams and many people. So, and I don't work there, so I can't speak for them. But it's a really good question.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Franzi?
I have a follow-up, a different question actually. So I'm also curious, has there been any studies relating online activity to offline behavior? Meaning, for example, what happened at the Capitol. I think a lot of people believe that, these people were fed misinformation or whatever. Or is it people correlated action on the streets, either in the US or during Arab Spring, for example, where people can correlate what happens in an online setting and whether this actually galvanizes people to, have actual protests on streets and so on. I just was curious if there's work like that, or are you aware of it? Yeah.
It's a great question. I don't have specific references, unfortunately, but I do think that this is an important question that people have studied. I think also in the context of radicalization, there's a question of, there's a potentially big gap between how people act on social media and what they consume, and then the actions that they take in the physical world. And I'm vaguely aware that there is study of that, also that transition, like what radicalizes people to the point of taking, say, violent actions in the real world. But I'm not familiar enough with it to speak intelligently to it. One thing I can speak more to that's a little bit related is that this is not just a question for us as researchers, but this is in some sense a holy grail of, speaking of privacy, kind of a holy grail for the online tracking and advertising industry. Not the same types of real world actions, but being able to link up, what they show you with, not just do you click on it and buy the product online, but do you change your real world behaviors? And so that's, it's an interesting question from multiple different angles.
Thank you.
I have a question just in general to anybody who's interested in answering me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, in training cybersecurity professionals, and I'm working on a project where we're trying to put together some guidance and structure around how to scaffold things that cybersecurity professionals need to learn for moving to be productive and effective in their jobs, and maybe try to standardize that in some way. How important do you think it is that AI and cybersecurity that be covered as part of the curriculum for that type of training? I'm not aware at this point in time. We've had a lot of conversations with people who have developed, pedagogy for different areas of cybersecurity training for professionals and so forth. I'm not aware of any specific sort of effort to try to include machine learning or AI or visualization types of information in that curriculum. I'm just wondering if people think that there's a real need for having that in general for any sort of cybersecurity professional.
Well, so I will take a stab at it. I think there's a challenge. Well, what you're asking is whether people that have a field of study that's not going to hit these things in depth should have some knowledge of them or some education about them. And
exactly.
I think the answer to that is yes. Of course, it's always anything that you put into a curriculum means that you have to take something else out, and so therein the challenge lies. But I think that these things are becoming so important that that they need to be addressed ought to be addressed at some level, so that when somebody sees reference to it, it's not automatically, but they have some place to start.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franzi, for your talk. I had some early experience a long time ago with a student who was getting information from Facebook and had to do it in a sort of circuitous way, and it led to some interesting things that were not exactly related to what it was that you were talking about, but as you talked about the difficulties and challenges of getting information from Facebook, then that resonated with me. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. It was great to be here. Thanks for the questions, and yeah, I hope Patrick's all right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. On the morrow then.